My name's Eugene Worley, and along with my wife Glenda, we have spent nearly 50 years in ministry in Ethiopia, Norway, the UK, and in the US. I'd like in these podcasts to share with you some of our experiences from those years.
Arriving back in Ethiopia after nearly 30 years, there was much to do in organizing our house, getting our driver's license, opening a bank account, and getting connected to the internet. This was no small job, as each thing required making sure we had all our documents in order, as well as going to different offices for each thing we did. For example, getting our driver's license required documentation from the American Embassy, as well as Department of Immigration to prove you had legal status, along with documents from the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Labor to confirm that you had permission to work in the country. Then when you went to the actual location where the driver's license was issued, there was always long lines, and the process required going from office to office to get a document stamped and approved. This often involved having someone to stand in line for you so you could get some lunch. It sometimes meant returning the next day to finish the process. This was a far cry from going to an office and getting everything done within minutes. In the early years, we never made a phone call, and computers were out of the question. We could now make phone calls, but the cost was prohibitive, so we didn't make any calls to the States. We did have the internet, and even though it was a pain to get online, we were still happy to have a connection with the outside world. Gene had to go back and forth to the internet office to get everything set up. One day he came home and said, "I know now why our internet service is so bad." I asked, "Why?" He said, "Well, when I went into the office, everything was sitting on a table and all the wires were all over the floor and everyone was walking on them." We had a good laugh, but we were still thankful that internet was available. Patience was a great virtue because sometimes it took an hour or more to get online. We could only get online by dial-up because broadband was not available at that time. I've always been technologically handicapped, and when Gene went on one of his country trips, he had to sit down and write out detailed notes for me. He would try to explain it to me, but I told him he would have to write it down step by step. Finally, after 3 pages of notes, I was able to get online, and I learned how to explore the World Wide Web.
We were anxious to get into the ministry as there was much to do. The Ethiopian churches, even though they had to go underground during the revolution, had thrived. It is often proven true that persecution strengthens the church and gives a deeper faith to the Christians. Just before we arrived, Pastor Berhanu Yosef and Boli Baptist Church had their annual rainy season Bible school. This was a special training program for the pastors and the evangelists, and it lasted 2 weeks. We arrived in time for the closing meeting, in which they always served a feast. That sounded good until we realized that they had roasted a goat. That was an adjustment, especially for Glenda. I told her that it was all in her head, and she said, "No, it's in my mouth." This was something else to get used to after being out of the country for 30 years. Soon after we arrived, we began Saturday classes in 2 of the churches, teaching on spiritual warfare. This was greatly needed in a country where Satan had such a stronghold. I taught the subject in English at one of the churches, and at the other church I used an interpreter. What a joy to have Tess Figosa to interpret for me. This is the same Tess Figosa who was one of the 3 blind young men who worked at the umbrella factory, and that we first met 30 years before. He had remained faithful all of these years. In November that year, I had the joy of joining Pastor Berhanu of the Boli Baptist Church and 10 of his church staff for a 3-day retreat. At the time, this church had about 200 members and 5 mission churches they were responsible for starting. I spoke 5 times in 3 days and dealt with some practical issues in the Christian life. The conference took place at a game park some 5 hours south of Addis Ababa. It was a great blessing to be able to invest in the lives of those men. During this same time, we met with Ethiopian pastors for the purpose of laying a foundation for the Bible College. Our goal was to help the churches to help themselves. The churches were indigenous and self-supporting, and we felt they should assume responsibility for the Bible College. This was in part because of the unstable political situation which would always shape our work as missionaries in the country. It was also to give them ownership so they would feel that it was their college and did not simply belong to a foreign missionary. To do that, we felt it was important to give them a realistic picture of the cost and the long-term commitment that was necessary for such an undertaking. We wanted to do our part by investing in equipment and the cost of setting up, but to encourage them to assume some of the responsibility in the operation and the finances. One of the churches had offered their facilities for classrooms, which would alleviate the cost of renting a building. Don and Phyllis Sidebottom had returned to the country 9 years earlier and under very difficult circumstances had provided basic training in the churches, but they wanted to offer a more advanced program for the Bible College. We finally settled on an evening program of classes meeting 4 times a week. This would allow students who had jobs to work and would also encourage more participation from the churches. Though there were those who still looked for a brick and mortar facility on its own property, we knew they had to crawl before they could walk. In the next few years, we trained many young men and women for the work of the Lord. One that will always stand out in my mind is a marriage student who, against great odds, completed 98 credit hours. He and his wife and daughter lived on a monthly income of $60 per month. The rent on their one-room home was $20 per month. In addition to that, they both had very serious health problems. Despite everything, he came to class on a Monday night and told me that he had preached the day before at his church. I asked him what his text was, and he told me that it was Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God and to them who are the called according to his purpose. I marvel that given everything he had endured, he was able to preach from that text. It made me realize that our labor was not in vain. In our next podcast, I want to talk to you about life on the streets of Addis Ababa.